Well, it's time now to take a look at the international newspapers. For that, we're joined by Alison Sargent. And Alison, we're going to start in Israel today as the situation there escalating with rockets fired into Israel and airstrikes back on Gaza.
Yeah, we can start with the Israeli press, Eve. Papers are reporting that the strikes in Gaza killed at least 20 people, 9 of them children. Israel Hayom notes that this was a response to the over 150 rockets fired into Israel by Hamas over the course of the day. Israel Hayom writes that the rioters in Jerusalem had been wreaking havoc, and they cite Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who said that Hamas had crossed a red line and that Israel would respond with force. Now, left-wing Israeli paper Haaretz is pleading against a response like that in their editorial today. Their headline here, Israelis don't need more lethal muscle flexing. The paper calls Monday's events a needless escalation that could have been avoided, and Haaretz accuses Netanyahu of trying to take advantage of the situation politically. The paper argues that as a caretaker prime minister, Netanyahu does not have the authority to, quote, drag Israel into a war that's just a contest of honor.
Because that's the Israeli papers looking at it. What about outside of Israel?
I would describe the European response as fatalism and resignation today. Spanish paper El Mundo headlines that Hamas and Israel have set off another spiral of violence. Their photo here shows a mother at a morgue in Gaza looking down at her dead children. Our policy at France 24 is to blur images like this one, but I can tell you it's an upsetting and pretty striking image to have chosen for El Mundo's front page. Here in France, Catholic paper La Croix headlines that it's a confrontation without end. They write that the situation is exacerbated by political crises unfolding on both sides. Israel can't create a stable government and keeps holding elections. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority keeps postponing their legislative elections. They haven't had a vote since 2006. French paper Le Figaro is looking, meanwhile, at some of the regional dynamics. They write that the honeymoon between Israel and its new Gulf allies may be over. And the paper's wondering if the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, which all recently restored their ties with Israel, may take the step of summoning their new Israeli ambassadors.
Okay. Let's move to Nepal there. The country's prime minister has published a piece in The Guardian appealing for international help with the coronavirus pandemic.
He writes that Nepal is being overwhelmed by COVID-19, much like neighboring India. It's worth noting that Nepal's Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli lost a vote of no confidence in Parliament on Monday, adding political turmoil to Nepal's problems with the pandemic. In this op-ed, he asks for help with vaccines, tests, oxygen kits, and other equipment, and says that his expectations for solidarity are quite high, particularly from the United Kingdom. He also writes that the pandemic has set back Nepal's efforts to deal with climate change, which has a huge impact on the country due to melting glaciers in the Himalayas, which have led to floods. Now, on the subject of the Himalayas, Eve, papers in Nepal are puzzling over reports that China plans to draw a separation line, as they're calling it, on the summit of Mount Everest. The idea is to prevent climbers from Nepal from mingling with those from Tibet. Although, as we read in the Kathmandu Post, no tourists have actually been allowed to climb up from the Tibetan side since the start of the pandemic. The paper explains that officials say a separation line would be impossible to enforce on the peak of Mount Everest, which has been described as, quote, a tiny, inhospitable area the size of a dinner table.
Indeed, it doesn't look like the roomiest place to, try and social distance. Finally, from you, Alison, a story for language nerds out there. French dictionaries finally weighing in on what has been a big debate here in France, and a debate I have to say that I had thought was settled a while ago, but it is whether or not the word COVID is masculine or feminine.
Well, it was sort of settled by the Académie Française, who weighed in and said that it was feminine, but that really hasn't worked for people because common usage, people put it as a masculine word, le Covid. The answer from dictionaries is good news for everyone like me who struggles still with gender in French, and that's that both of them are okay. We read in Le HuffPost that dictionaries don't even agree with each other. Le Petit Robert says it can be both, but masculine is more commonly used. Larousse says also that it can be both, but that feminine is more correct, since, of course, that's what the Académie Française said. Anyway, Eve, like I was saying, this whole debate did happen because the Académie Française took so long to make their decision that by the time they decided it was feminine, everyone was already using it as masculine. But again, it totally works for me because I wish all words could be gender flexible.
I have to say, I love having neutral words, things for things. Alison Sargent, thanks a lot for that look at the international papers. Time for a quick break now, but still to come this hour. Our Focus Report takes us to meet the single women in France who are travelling abroad in order to have children. That and more in the next half hour of the programme. Do stay with us.